Please come on in. So, thank you everybody for coming out for CloudFormation. It's the last session on the last day. I really appreciate it. We got some dedicated people here. I really like that. Thank you. So if you've used CloudFormation before, can you raise your hand? Cool. We've got a bunch of folks that have used CloudFormation. So I am super excited about CloudFormation, and the reason that I'm excited about CloudFormation is that I had this aha moment with it where I do for all of our services that I get really excited about. And I started with Amazon a little over 4 years ago with Amazon Web Services, and the way that I learned about AWS is I dove into the software development kit, in particular the Java SDK, with Eclipse, and it was just a blast. I loved it. And so when CloudFormation came out, in my mind I was thinking, we need to give our customers lots of options, because I like the Java SDK. There's others that might like the management console. There's some that might like the command line interface. There's others that like the Node.js SDK, the Python SDK. So this is just, to me at the time, I was thinking this might be just one more option to give our customers flexibility. But the more I dove into it, the more excited I got about it, because it does a lot of things that are super, super helpful, super exciting. So for me, the aha moment was when I was deploying a VPC, virtual private cloud, with subnets and routing and lots of other capabilities with security groups, which I frequently do because I do a lot of demos, and I want to stand up environments, show them, tinker with them a lot, and tear them down quite a bit. And before I was using CloudFormation, when I did this, I found myself worrying about lots of dependencies, how I was going to bring them up and tear them down, right? So when I used CloudFormation, what happened was I would click on a template, and it would create the whole environment for me. And then if I wanted to change one little piece, which I frequently do, because for those of you that are familiar with AWS security groups, you know that you can make them very restrictive based upon your current IP address. So frequently I will update the IP address. Those updates are super simple in CloudFormation. And then when I want to tear down the environment, I can go ahead and tear it down. So that was my aha moment, but there's a much bigger paradigm shift that's going on here. So for those of you that have been in IT a long time, and I've certainly been in IT a long time, when I was responsible for developing software as an engineering manager, and there's lots of folks in here that are IT-focused systems administrators, there's perhaps some business folks in here. But you know, in the old days, as a software engineering manager, you would be developing software. But there was not the same versioning and control of the infrastructure. And so if you wanted to be prepared to test new software, to run new software, you had to make sure the capital was there, and the investment, and the networking, and the cabling, and the hardware. You needed the test environments to be in place. But moreover, more importantly, if you're in the situation where you're selling to customers that have to have this, they need to order all that capital and infrastructure ahead of time. I was responsible for telecom software, and telecoms are very careful organizations, or certainly in those days they were very, very careful, because the uptime requirements are extensive, and I'm sure they still are. Very, very careful about the infrastructure that they put in place. And so they had to order that capital a long time in advance. And so what that meant is that our software had to conform to the capital that they were purchasing and the infrastructure that they had. That doesn't really make sense when you think about it. How cool would it be if you could deploy the infrastructure, manage it and control it, so that the infrastructure matches your software? That's in your applications. That's a real paradigm shift that's going on now, and CloudFormation enables that, and that's really, really cool. So when you want to deploy a test environment, all you have to do is click a few buttons, and that test environment deploys. Or if you want to deploy a development environment, you can click on a few buttons and select some different options so that you have smaller infrastructure, because you don't want to spend as much money. Production, you might want to deploy quite a bit more, slightly different, have different controls. You might want different people to access it, but you can use the same fundamental templates. And so what's happening now is we have a real change in the way that software and applications are now matched up with the infrastructure needed for them. And this is super exciting. It's why I'm so excited about CloudFormation. So some challenges, and for the folks in the back, if you could put the monitor on for me, I'd really appreciate that. So for some challenges that customers had is that they have wanted to be able to maintain the infrastructure. And they wanted to match up their AWS resources, right, with what they were deploying, and they needed to have a way to create those. But moreover, when they were doing it, they wanted to make sure that it could be version controlled and orderly. So if they needed a database to be up first, let's say before their web servers were up, they wanted to be able to do that. So they had some problems or some challenges that they were looking for us to solve. So what is CloudFormation? So CloudFormation is templates. It's a declarative way of specifying the resources. Now, I was talking about the software. Thank you. The slide just came up over here. So I was talking before about the Java SDK, software development kit that I was using. And the Java SDK, right, you could declare you can call the SDK and it would send messages over to our APIs for you, right? And it would bring up the resources, but there was a lot of complexity to that. For instance, if you got messages back like it didn't succeed, you had to have the software to say, okay, what do we do now? CloudFormation abstracts quite a bit of this for you. And now what you can do is you can take your CloudFormation templates, and I'll show you in a little bit some examples of snippets of templates so that you can see them, but you can deploy multiple copies of these templates. So you'll frequently hear the statement infrastructure as code, and that's really the paradigm shift that's happening here. You're able to deploy your infrastructure as code. Templates can be stored in a source control system, so if there's any business leaders here or IT leaders that want to know what's going on. So if there's a change and all of a sudden we're deploying something and it's not working, can I roll back, right? Or I want to check out the tip of the source control. That's frequently what we do, and we do builds with configuration management. You can do that now with source control systems, and then you can roll back if you ever have a challenge. And that's a huge advantage. It's very predictable. You know what's happening. So it's declarative and flexible. So I'll show in a little bit how this works with resources, but it's really neat. So what you do is you specify, I want this resource, and a resource could be, let's say, an EC2 instance. And you specify that, and what happens is when you load up that template and start it up, it will go ahead and start that EC2 instance for you. But if you want a different EC2 instance, it's really easy to do that, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can do that. But that, you can do it with parameters is one way that you can do that. And so let's say I want a small EC2 instance because I manage development, but my friend over there wants a bigger EC2 instance because he manages production. He can specify that when he executes that EC2 instance, he or she. It's easy. It's really easy. Now, it's in JSON, for those of you who are familiar with JSON. Now, JSON's got its own style and such. It takes a little bit to get used to JSON. I'll say that right up front. But it's pretty straightforward because a lot of the complexity CloudFormation takes care of for you. You don't have to worry about things like retries. It keeps track of all that for you. You can also use it to integrate with your development tools. So if you want to do, for instance, continuous integration and continuous deployment, as we heard in the prior session on ECS, which is very, very important, there's excellent ways to do that with CloudFormation that you can go ahead and make that part of your process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is, gives you a little bit of window into some of the different aspects of CloudFormation. You have the templates. You can use it to automatically provision resources. It's easy to version, to replicate and update the infrastructure and applications using these templates, and it integrates with other development, continuous integration, and continuous deployment. So if you want to use Jenkins with Chef, if you want to use, there's a capability to deploy applications or updates to applications just with CloudFormation. Others want to use AWS's code deploy, code commit, code pipeline, right? You can do all of that using CloudFormation. So some common use cases. Stack replication. We talked about that a little bit. And a common example is if you have a development organization, you have a testing organization, you have production, maybe you have user acceptance, and all of these organizations want to fire up the same environment, right? What you can do is they can use the same template. There's no reason for them to have used different templates. They can use the same one. The neat part is, when they're done with it, let's say a development environment or a testing environment, you can just delete the stack, the whole stack of resources, and it goes away. It's really neat to be able to control your infrastructure through software in that way. You can use it for scale out. Now, for those of you that are very AWS savvy, you know that one way we do scale out, customers frequently do, is through elastic load balancers and auto-scaling groups. But there's other types of scale out. For instance, you might want to add some task nodes to your EMR cluster. For instance, there's other types of things that you might want to do. Some organizations might not want to use auto-scaling groups and might want to control their EC2 instances very carefully, right? You can use that. You can use CloudFormation for that. So you can go ahead and use CloudFormation for expanding your resources for your scale-out. You can use it for what we call blue-green deployments. If you want to, say, make a change, so one way of doing versioning that some people use is to create a new Amazon machine image. Amazon machine images you can think of as your gold copy of your bootable, for booting EC2. So some organizations want to make another version of their AMI and then stand up a whole new environment with it. So what you can do is you can use this to stand up a whole new environment and then shut off the other environment, right? So once your new environment's up, you start pointing your traffic to your new environment, and then you just shut down your other environment. That's a new paradigm that you can't do on-premise very easily, right? Most folks don't have the kind of infrastructure around that you can temporarily kick off a whole fleet of EC2 instances and then just turn them off in a few minutes after the other ones are up. In the sense of if you were to compare it to on-premise, in AWS, it's very, very easy to do. So I like this slide, pricing. There's no charge for CloudFormation. You do pay for the resources you use. So if you stand up EC2 instances, there's a bill for EC2 instances or the EBS volumes. But there's no charge for CloudFormation. And so you can use CloudFormation, develop incredible amounts of templates, complex templates, and go ahead and use those. And there's no cost for using it. This is one of those services that we provide to help in your use of AWS. This is some example services that we have. You can see there's quite a bit. There's more. And we're always doing updates to CloudFormation. So recently, this was announced on June 9th, we added VPC flow logs and Amazon Kinesis Firehose. Now you can specify through Node.js, you can specify your Lambda code inline. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you can do with this. You can make changes to SNS, topic updates, Kinesis stream names. And this last one I'm particularly excited about because there's a new auto-scaling policy that stipulates that you can have the full auto-scaling group, make sure it's fully up and running before it replaces the old auto-scaling group if you're thinking about EC2 instances. For anyone that's new to AWS, auto-scaling groups are used typically for scaling out EC2 server instances and scaling them down. And so this is a really neat function because in production, several times you want to wait till your whole environment's up and running and then switch the traffic over to the new environment. And this allows an automated way of doing that. Whoops. So how to get started. So we talked a little bit about this, the stacks, the templates, parameters. So I'll start with there. So you can pass parameters into the templates. So if you think about it, frequently you'll want to say, I need an auto-scaling group. I need EC2 instances. You might want to set up your virtual private network. But there's some things you want to parameterize. For instance, if an example I was mentioning before, you want your developers using small EC2 instances because they're not handling production traffic, and you want your production environment in very large EC2 instances. You can make those parameters, which is really super helpful. You can also set up policies. Policies are pretty neat. And for those of you that are familiar with EC2, where you can say, through the management console, for example, you can put on termination protection. You can think of this as similar to that, where if you stand up a stack, right, and you get all these resources running, you don't want to make it too easy to accidentally delete it if you think about a production environment. And so what you can do is you can set up policies, for instance, on what you can do and can't do in terms of updates and deletes. Now, you can override these policies, right, if needed, because sometimes you do need to make changes, but it allows you protection for the resources that were created when your stack was created. So the basic steps, right? You can start from a template that you just create, but the way that I get started when I do these is I go to the templates, the sample templates that we have, just because it's an easy way to get going, and I modify the sample templates, and that's on our website under CloudFormation. You can see there's just a huge number of sample templates there with some very common usage patterns. Then you upload that template to CloudFormation and you execute it, and it's really neat because you can enter the cloud, if you're doing it through the user interface, you just enter those parameter values, you set up your policies and tags, and you review and you create it. Now this is getting into a little bit of code, and when I was thinking about what to present today, I was thinking, wow, right before the last session, right before people are going home or to happy hour or dinner, wherever you're going, it's kind of living on the edge a little bit, presenting code. So I hope I don't put folks to sleep with this, but I am going to present the code. So this is a snippet of how you'd create a resource. So you can see it's in the resources section of the JSON. EC2 instance is specified there as for the type. So the first part, EC2 instance, that's a label that I created. Underneath it, the type specifies that this is going to create an EC2 instance. For the properties, the instance type, that reference there is referencing a parameter that's just not shown. This is a snippet here. We'll get to parameters in another bit. But essentially, what I want to do is to go back to that example of the developer. I want the developer to be able to specify that instance type for their development environment. For here, security groups, it's referencing an input. So one of the things that I might want to do for a developer, since it's not a production environment, I might want to give them more leeway in terms of their security groups. So when they go ahead and set this up, that they can see that. They can select that. Key name, super important. For those of you that have used EC2 before, you know, through the management console, there's that warning that says, enter the key name, and if you don't put in a valid key, you're not going to be able to access this EC2 instance. And so we want people to be able to select a key name and to be able to enter it. And then the image ID. Now this image ID, it has this find and map functionality. And this is complex looking in JSON, especially the first time you look at it, but it's super powerful. And what it's doing is saying that there's two different architecture types. We have the hardware virtual machines and the paravirtual machines. And so when somebody goes to create an instance, we need to be able to find the Amazon machine image ID. And so which type of architecture it is the first thing we look at. And we compare it against a list. And it's finding it in a map against a list. And it's not shown here, but this code is in our sample code, how to do this. And then it's saying it's using a built-in function, the AWS region, to say which region is this. And by using the region and the architecture type, we're able to determine the Amazon machine image ID. So we're automatically going out and selecting the AMI to start from. And this is, again, it looks a little bit complex the first time you see it, but it's repeated many, many times in our sample code, so you can see it as a pattern to use. You don't have to always think about how to write this. It's really neat because you'll start seeing these patterns over and over again, and you just copy and paste those in. And it's really very easy to do once you get used to seeing, okay, aha, this is the mapping, right? So this is a build slide, and I'm an engineer at heart, and so fancy build slides, I inherited these slides, are just not really my thing. So I'm going to go ahead and build it out, and then we'll talk about it. And so essentially, one of the things you could think about, and this is a food ordering website. It's just a way of thinking about it. Many of you are here from the different federal agencies. There's education folks here, very, very large enterprises. There's probably not a lot of folks here because they're looking to build food ordering websites, but it's a way to think about CloudFormation. Because if you look at this, you can easily envision a food ordering website where it has services in it. Now you can think of this as service-oriented architecture. You could think of it as microservices, however you like to think about your architecture, but you could easily see each one of these being a separate CloudFormation stack. So if you wanted to go ahead and instantiate a whole CloudFormation stack, you could, for instance, say, I want to instantiate the recommendation service, or I want to instantiate the whole inventory service. And you could have them be separate CloudFormation stacks so you can separately manage those. You could have separate developers, you could have separate operations people, and so they could live separately if you wanted to manage it that way, which is a way to think about services, right? You could also do them in a way that's ordered. And if you remember in the beginning, we talked about some of the challenges that customers want ordered ways and predictable ways of deploying infrastructure. And so you'll see that there's depends on there between the ordering website and the payment service. You could have the ordering website, JSON, call the payment service and use the depends on command within the JSON to make it so that you can do one before the other. So essentially what you're saying is that I need to have that payment service, right, before, or the ordering website, whichever way you want it, before the other one. That's really, really powerful to be able to do. Frequently you have situations with databases where you might need the database to be up before the applications or the web servers. And so to be able to say which one goes up first for IT folks, super important. So if you think about the food catalog website running on AWS, the first thing you need to do is you need to think about security groups, right? And so you could specify your security groups. And you'll need an EC2 instance. We showed the resource for how to create an EC2 instance. You might want a whole bunch of them and put them in an auto-scaling group. You can specify this all through the resources in the JSON, and you could put in an ELB. And if you want, we talked about continuous integration, continuous deployment. You could pull in your software. You could do that in your AMIs, or you could do it, as we said before, with other capabilities such as Chef and Jenkins. And then you could reference other services. You could easily see the database at the top, an inventory service, and a recommendation service. And then you can also do elastic cache if you want to improve your performance. Okay, so this is a little bit more JSON. Now, with this JSON, you can see here I'm specifying the web server group, the auto-scaling group, and the properties tell me the minimum size and the maximum size. And so you can see with the JSON, you can declare that. Now we could use parameters, right, if we wanted to, but here we're just putting it in there. I think it shows better that way. And I'm referencing a parameter for the load balancer. Down below, this is just showing you where the other resources would be. The load balancer, the cache cluster, and the alarm are down there, and those would also be specified as resources with similar information to what we're showing for the web server group. Oops. Yes, the question was, will these go out in SlideShare? These slides will be shared. So this is parameters right here, and what we're doing is we're showing the different parameters. And this is really cool because you can see, for instance, the service key, you might want to have it not shown, such as a password. So you see the no echo is true, right? And the instance type, you might want to have a default, but still allow it to be entered. But you might want to have allowed values and show your users a constraint description. And so it's very structured in the sense that when you write this JSON and you roll it out to your organization, the way you want it to run is there. And for folks, and I don't know how many folks here have managed IT organizations, but IT organizations want their scripts to run the same every time. They want it to be very predictable. They want their system admins to be able to enter information and get it so that it comes up with only the allowed values. And this allows that type of control. So the other thing that's here that I think is important is the outputs. And when it's done, you can get information out of the CloudFormation template. And right here, we're using a intrinsic function, or you can think of it as a built-in function, that's essentially using the label load balancer and getting the DNS name out. So what we're looking for is the DNS name from this load balancer. And there's a whole list of information that you can get as outputs. This can be really helpful. If you want to start sending traffic based upon the load balancer's DNS name, this allows you to do that. So you can also, as we talked about before, you can use it to deploy software. So what we've talked about now, going back to the paradigm change before, we mentioned now we got infrastructure that matches your software, your applications. Now what we're talking about is if you want to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, or change those applications without changing the actual infrastructure. The capability here is of doing that. And what this is showing that you can go ahead and specify information, and what we can do is there's a command called cfn init, and see if it's on a future one of my other slides here, but you can use cfn init to specify information, right? And it's right there, CloudFormation init. And you can specify the information such as the files you want to load, packages that you want to load onto the EC2 instance. And then when the EC2 instance starts up, it'll pull in this information. And then you can start a daemon, cfn hup, that will go ahead and listen for any changes that you have. And so what you can do is using CloudFormation, you can push changes out to your infrastructure, which is very, very powerful. So these are some of the language features that we have here. We have seen some of them. Find and map, I used earlier to allow us to find the Amazon machine image to start with. Really, really powerful. It's a little, the syntax takes a little while to get used to, but it's very easy just to copy and paste. There's get availability zones for the region that you're in. Okay, so now this is an example of the management console. It's pretty straightforward. You select a template. It could be an S3. You could upload it from your local file system if you're using a PC or a Mac as I use. And then what the thing to do with it that I generally do is I go ahead and verify it if I haven't used it before. Click the verify, because with JSON, and I don't know how many folks have used JSON here, but there's generally a bracket that I have missing. And I use that template to, the verify to do that. And then you simply operate the stack. You've created the stack. Now, if I want to, with the stack here, you'll see there's actions. So if I've created a giant environment and I say, oh my, I don't want that anymore, you can go ahead and delete it. You want to update it? You can update it. It's really, really easy. So a basic workflow, essentially, now this changes the paradigm for development. So a basic workflow here is you design, you write your application code, but you also do your infrastructure templates. It's now part of your process. You create your stacks and you iterate. So now the infrastructure becomes part of that whole development lifecycle that we used to think of before as being separate from the infrastructure. The interesting part about it is now that the software, the infrastructure's as code, you can do code reviews on it too, and other types of things that you used to do with software, right? You can think about it in terms of integration, version control, all those types of things that those of us that have been working in software for quite a long time think about as our software. Now it's applicable to infrastructure as code. So we want to organize it like it's software. So for folks here that are responsible for many, many different organizations, different teams, whole projects, I don't know if there's any folks here from PMOs, the program management offices, but you want to think of this as software and organize it. So you could see having front-end services, back-end services, perhaps with different CloudFormation stacks, right? And shared services you might want to have, like a CRM DB that showed there. Your base network, the thing that I'm always starting up and taking down, that's just such a time saver for me in my day-to-day job to be able to do that. It's just huge. And then your identity and access management you might want to manage separately. So I'm going to build this out. So this is just saying the point, but just a little bit of a different way. So what we typically do with application software, we do our designs and whatever our development process is, whether it's agile or modified waterfall, whatever you're doing, you end up with source code. You package all that source code up with all the files and however you want to do it. If it's Java, it might go into an interpreter, right? If it's other types of code, it'll go into a loader, and then you get your desired application state essentially running. That's on the left, the application software. On the right, we do something similar with JSON. We get our JSON templates, we either write them, or there's some third-party applications that people write to generate the JSON. You have your JSON templates, you load them into CloudFormation, and you get your desired state in CloudFormation. And so it's a there's quite an analogy there between now the CloudFormation software as code and the actual, or excuse me, infrastructure as code and the actual application software. So when you now have it in production, you have a whole stack running, and you want to do an update, you have some choices. What you can do is you can do an update in place, or as I mentioned before, you can do a blue-green deployment. If you do an update in place, it can be faster, right? And it can be more cost efficient because you only have one copy of all of your infrastructure and resources. And it could be simpler because if you're not taking up and down EC2 instances or creating new auto-scaling groups, it could just be a lot simpler. On the other hand, with the blue-green, you're not touching a working stack. So if you have a problem and something were to happen in creating that, and you are doing the update, you don't have that other copy to switch your traffic back to, right? So if you're doing something that's exceptionally critical, you can't have any problems with it. You know you have a working copy, let's say on the left, right? And you want to switch your copy to the right. It's really much safer to stand up a whole separate environment, kick the tires on it, make sure it's running right, and then switch the traffic over to it. So now this is really cool. We have this neat new feature, Lambda, and I don't know if any of you guys had a chance to see any of the Lambda type activities this week, but Lambda is really neat. It's our serverless architecture where you can use Node.js and Java, for instance, to based upon events to execute the code, right? And one of the things that you can do now is call Lambda functions from CloudFormation. So it's really neat, and some great examples of are listed on the slide, but one of them for Amazon Machine Image ID, if you remember before, I specified that you could use those map functions to look at the architecture and then the region you're in to choose the right AMI ID. And that map function is looking up for the AMI ID. I didn't show it on the slide because it would have taken a lot, and this late in the day on the last day of the event probably would have made people a little bit blind. It would have been small, but it's all hard-coded, right, those AMI IDs. Now, for Windows servers especially, those AMIDs change frequently. And so if you want to always get the latest AMID, you can now have Lambda go ahead and do it for you, because they can look it up dynamically by that call out to Lambda, which is really neat. Or if you want to have it find out information about your environment outside your current stack, for instance, about VPCs or subnets and such, it can go ahead and do that activity for you, right? And so it's really, really powerful to be able to do that. So this is a little bit more of the same message before, but it's just so exciting because the paradigm change and what it means to us as IT folks is just so huge. About infrastructure provisioning, you could do it on the left side of the slide, you do deployment as code, and on the right side of the slide, you can deploy your application. You can do that continuous integration, continuous deployment. As Chris spoke about in the prior ECS presentation, continuous deployments are really, it's a great thing to do for folks that really want to make sure they're exercising their ability to deploy. That when you go ahead and do that a lot, when you're only doing smaller changes, your risk for each of those smaller changes goes down. And so it's super powerful to be able to do continuous integration and continuous deployment, and you can go ahead and do that application deployment using CloudFormation. So I'm going to go through some best practices, and then I'm going to wrap up there. So these best practices are also listed on our website, and so I think they're really important, so I wanted to go through them because a lot of folks here, I'm sure, are going to go back to their organizations and think about how to go ahead and do this in their own organizations, how to structure it and organize it. When it's somebody, just yourself, and you're just tinkering with it, these types of things might not be quite as important, but when you're thinking about large organizations, as you have in the public sector, these things are really important to look at. You want to organize your stacks by lifecycle and ownership. So if you have a database group, for instance, that may have separate lifecycle from an applications group, and the database group wants to manage their infrastructure separately, they can have their own stacks, for instance. And they can version and control that as a service. You might want to have your test team have their own infrastructure, although they might want to be able to you share the stacks, right, with the development team, the templates, I mean, with the development team and the production organization. And that's the second bullet, is to reuse the stacks. Don't create separate stacks for development, test, and production if it's the same stuff, right? Just make them parameters. Verify quotas for all resource types. So if you look at EC2 in the management console, you'll see that there's a link that says limits. Make sure you're looking at that. Frequently, we start out with soft limits for EC2 instances. It's about 20 for starting out. And if you get up to 18 and you want to kick off another 18 instances, you're going to run into a problem. Now, we can take care of increasing that limit for our customers, right? But that's something that folks need to reach out to us for. So you want to look at your soft limits, though, and make sure if you're moving into production that you've got enough headroom to work in production. Use nested stacks. So before I showed 2 stacks in the example of the grocery or food ordering website, one of them said depends on. So you can nest the stack. So you can call one stack from the other stack and make one depend on the other, which is really a neat capability. Now, under creating templates, this is something I'm really passionate about because I get called a lot when folks put credentials where they shouldn't, and then they're exposed. And I have customers call me, email me, and I get on calls, and I can't say this enough. Be careful with your credentials, right? If you put them into places where they shouldn't be, such as JSON, or store them in your Amazon machine images, right? What happens is that they're easy to get out into the wild, and you don't want that. So not only do you want to make sure that you're not putting your credentials into your JSON, but also make sure you're using fine-grained credentials. What I mean by that is if the person executing the JSON doesn't need to have credentials for lots of other things, there's no need to give them credentials for lots of other things. Same way with our EC2 roles, for instance. You want to use, if you're using EC2 roles for EC2 instances to be able to go out and access other services, you want to make sure you're doing fine-grained controls there as well. So use AWS-specific parameter types. I think in the parameter section, and I would have to go back to look, but we have very specific parameter types. So if you specify a parameter type, we will make sure that that parameter type is input. So if you're looking for availability zones, right, you can specify availability zones, and we will make sure of that parameter type. Use parameter constraints. So if you're looking for a CIDR, an IP address, right, or a range of IP addresses, use constraints for that. The one on the bottom, make sure you test your templates before you put them into production. I tinker with templates a lot, and I can't tell you how many brackets I've missed. Every time I think I haven't missed a bracket, I've missed a bracket. So please test your templates before you put them into production. So you want to manage all your stack resources through CloudFormation. So what happens is if you create a stack using CloudFormation, that resource is there, and then you go in on the side and delete the resource, the resources in your environment is going to be a disconnect between what CloudFormation thinks is there and what's actually there. So if you're using CloudFormation to kick off your resources, manage them through CloudFormation. This next bullet, create change sets. This is really cool functionality. Before you go ahead and do a change to your stack, you can see what's going to happen if you deploy the change. You can essentially have it analyze for you what the impact's going to be if you change. That's really powerful before you go ahead and say, go ahead, do this. Use stack policies. We talked before about that you can say, don't accidentally delete this resource, right? So you can say that for a policy that unless it's changed, that restrict the updates that can be done on a resource. Track your changes to CloudFormation using CloudTrail. Super important in large organizations, so you have auditability, you know who's done what. And lastly, use code reviews for CloudFormation, because now it's infrastructure as code. So I have about 1.5 minutes left. And rather than taking questions up here, because I know lots of folks want to get to their activities afterwards, I'm going to say thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.